Thanks for sending it down here, Bob. I'm here on the sideline with the man of the hour, Wax. How does it feel to break the cube wide open?
Wow, Doc. So, I gotta say, I've been training my whole life for this moment, and it's just like my heart and soul, they were in the deck, and you just get past the broken combos. You don't not take the broken combo.
And at what point did you realize that Thassa's Oracle and trade routes was just utterly cracked?
I would say it was about pick 2 of pack 1. I'm looking at the pack. I'm like, what is this card here that costs 2 blue and says win the game on it? Is this card busted?
Yeah.
And in my early days of Magic playing, I was looking at the card trade routes, and I was like, oh, this card's kind of cool. Like, it just make sure you never flood out, right? But it turns out when the activations are absolutely free, it kind of does stuff, It kind of does stuff. And I think I got past the card also sometime in pack 1, and from there on, it was just like, if it says cycle for free, I'm taking it.
Well, I gotta say, it was a real thrill to be there for this epic moment in Cube history. What do you have to say to all the fans out there?
I gotta say, ban Thassa's Oracle in every format.
Thanks, Wax. Back to you up in the booth, Bob. Hello and welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I am your host, Andy, and I'm here with my co-host, Anthony, repairman of Broken Cubes Maddox.
I did have to emergency fix a cube. I see what you're saying there, yeah.
You lived what I think many people would describe as the cube nightmare. You yourself have expressed this as a fear about cube design, is that you'll design a cube that has some hole in it, some egregiously overpowered deck that you didn't see when you were designing it, and then someone just breaks the cube wide open, and that kind of happened to us over the weekend.
Okay, that fear is a little bit different. I'm more afraid that, let's say worst case scenario, my regular cube was put on Magic Online as one of the featured cubes.
Mm-hmm.
I think that immediately, obviously everybody would hate it because they're like, why are all the cards bad, blah, blah, blah. But then it would just be like, oh yeah, just like draft like red-white, that's the only deck that matters. But it would take some time for that kind of failure to become evident.
It's funny to me that you think that's the failure you're afraid of, because I feel like that's so much less evident. Like, even if theoretically someone can, like, people will always disagree about that.
I can just hear LSV's voice, just like, yeah, cube's fine, just yeah, draft red white. He doesn't sound like that. He sounds much cooler. But in this particular instance, we had the extreme case where the cube was literally broken. In the game design,
my heart
sense
sank a little bit.
You were no
sad.
longer playing a game. It was just, yes, this is the one optimal deterministic strategy. And the thing we're talking about is we finally got to draft the Turbo Cube in paper. A very astute player decided to take trade routes and Thassa's Oracle, and we discovered that if you just put 38 lands, I think you can mulligan down to just 3 cards. As long as you get trade routes in your hand, you can threaten a win on turn 2.
And importantly, this player didn't do exactly that. They also had about 15 or 16 other free
Right.
cycling cards, which had the upside of possibly being able to remove their opponent's threats or buy them time or whatever. And I gotta say, as a person that loves trade routes, I was very heartbroken to see it happen. And I assume that you've cut Thassa's Oracle, hopefully, and not trade routes.
That had to be emergency banned.
Yeah.
There's a lot of interesting learning there. I will say, to this player's credit, so I actually met them in the finals. I actually did take a game off them somehow.
They must have really screwed up.
Right, we're trying to give them credit here. They actually had me dead to a big pile of 8/8 Krakens, to the Thassa's Oracle, and they had milled me all in the same turn. So I think they were really doing it. They did a great job with this cube. But yeah, Thassa's Oracle is just apparently, people actually requested it, and I added it in. I was aware of this interaction, but didn't really think it through.
Yeah. Well, now it's happened. Like, the worst thing has happened that can happen in cube design. I mean, and you've lived through it, and so now it's all uphill from here, right?
Fair enough. And I think I learned a lot.
Saying it's all uphill from here, if you hear someone say it's all uphill from here, is that bad or good to you?
That sounds bad.
See, but I think it's because we're cyclists. I think that's good. If people say it's all downhill from here, they mean that's bad. But we ride bikes everywhere.
Interesting. Yeah, you're right.
I've had this problem with this saying forever,
Yeah.
where people say, "Oh, it's all downhill from here." I'm like, "Sounds great.
Perfect.
No more pedaling. Don't have to pedal anymore. I can just coast. This will be great."
But I think there was a lot to be learned. Obviously, like the real problem with that experience is like there is an optimal strategy, and it's put 38 islands in your deck, and like that sucks.
It's a particular bummer of an optimal
it's
experience.
a bummer. So like,
yeah.
even if you're winning, a lot of times it's like, okay, this isn't fun to lose to, but this is also an extreme case where it's like, okay, my draft doesn't really matter. I'll just put a bunch of islands, and like making the optimal thing a really not fun thing.
And making, as the person that played this person in round 1, making my entire deck completely irrelevant. It literally did not matter what my cards were. I had one Phyrexian Revoker, which mattered because I could name trade routes with it.
Very cool.
I had one Harsh Mentor, which I thought this surely must matter. And then upon closer reading of the card after resolving it with my smug grin on my face, my opponent said, actually, that doesn't matter because it doesn't count enchantments. So trade routes does not trigger Harsh Mentor. And then I also had one other card that vaguely mattered. I had a Cranial Archive, which could have forced the opposing player to cycle through the library twice instead of once.
Wow, big ask.
Well, I mean, theoretically, if I had done it at the right moment, it could have messed them up. But either way, it made very few of my cards matter, which I think is, one of those patterns we try and avoid in Cube, where your cards just don't matter. It doesn't matter what you took, it doesn't matter the decisions you made, and they were all made irrelevant. But that's the danger of playing with such a fiery cube like the Turbo Cube.
So it was interesting. I'm honestly surprised. I don't think I'm planning any other immediate changes. Obviously, we have done some playtesting of this cube before. It's been iterated upon. But yeah, I mean, like I can't remember like the first time we drafted my regular cube, the list of things I was immediately like, this all has to change, just because you see the cube experience so differently when you start playing it. But this felt pretty solid otherwise. Games went like fairly long. They were fairly interactive. I got wrecked by a Deadly Designs, which was very cool.
I had a lot of fun too. I thought my deck was cool. I had this like artifact aggro deck that had outs to milling my opponent out with Altar of Dementia and Nettle Cyst. Just basically, for every creature I have, you're going to mill cards for all the artifacts I have, which is pretty cool. I liked that. Yeah, it was a cool cube. I enjoyed the draft, and honestly, wasn't even that tilted that somebody totally broke the environment and I had to play against them. It was like, oh, interesting, you did it. It was kind of fun to watch.
I mean, that's the most I can expect for such a silly environment, where it's like, we're all going to explore this together and learn about Magic by breaking it.
I love trade routes.
It's a very cool card.
How much is a foil? You got to get a Mercadian Masks foil.
If you asked me a year ago, it might have been within reach.
Is it too expensive now?
I haven't even looked.
It's like probably played in some weird EDH decks, but it's far from an EDH staple. Give us a price check, Anthony.
$100.
Are you serious? Magic cards, what happened to you? Oh my goodness gracious. All right, well, maybe for Christmas-ish I'll get you a foil trade routes from Mercadian
Here's
Masks.
this card you really don't want.
you really don't want, but I really want to see it, and I want to play it in the Turbo Cube. The best gifts are ones that you actually just want, and you give it to somebody else. That's the most kind of thoughtful.
Hey,
gift.
Those foil eggs you gave me are getting put to use.
Yeah, well, I just happen to have those. I don't even know why. That's just where I'm at in my life. On this week's episode of Lucky Paper Radio, we're not going to continue to talk about the Turbo Cube, either
we're done with it.
For better or worse. I mean, maybe you want to hear more about it. Maybe you're tired of it. Instead, we have a great topic suggestion from listener Lemem. Lemem has asked us, Anthony, to talk about Manabases in Cube from a drafting and deck building perspective.
Hi, Andy. Hi, Anthony. Garrett here, better known as Lemem in the online community. I had a discussion topic that I would like to hear about, and that's mana bases. How do they impact your draft and your deck building decisions? And do you have any general guidelines you try to follow? Thanks.
Put our game designer hat aside for a moment. Let's stop talking about how to get fixing lands to include in our cube and how to combat the 5-color good stuff problem. Just put our player hat on. We're Spikes. We're trying to build the best mana bases we can. I thought this was a great question because it only occurred to me when Lemem asked that Cube is kind of unique in that retail limited formats, with basically no exceptions, you don't really have the luxury of drafting a mana base. It's not really a decision you get to make in draft, like, do I want to take a fixing land or not? If you get a fixing land on color, great, but there's so few fixing lands to go around, and in most sets they're so low power level, they're, tap duels or something, that it's not really a decision you get to make. And then when you're deck building, you just play any on-color duels you have, but usually mana bases are just quite bad. And so this is an area where it's a very unique to playing Cube, I think, this idea of drafting and building good mana bases in limited decks, because it doesn't happen very often in retail limited.
I'll disagree a little bit because there's still a huge aspect to, like, even when you're just constructing with basic lands, the rest of your deck still matters. There's still other incidental effects that are not just, the uncommon 2-colored tap land. And constructing a deck, can I splash? Do I have enough, incidental sources? That all still matters. But I think what you're getting at is it's not just how do I figure out what colors I'm playing and choose the right basics. It's you're actually drafting lands, which doesn't come up so much.
Yeah, it does matter certainly in Retail Limited, but it's a very different process and equation, I think, in Cube when you're trying to figure out what your mana base looks like. So we're going to talk about how we do that when we are playing cubes, and you and I have played a lot of cubes, so I think we have an interesting perspective on that.
I think this is also a great topic because we talk mostly about cube from a design perspective because that's what interests us. It's something I think that's
we're not Pro Tour players.
I'm so glad you brought that up. Yeah.
Though I do think I'm a better drafter and deck builder than I am a player because I draft and deck build a lot more because I'm always simulating drafts and stuff. I think that I've put more time and effort into that, and then when I play, I'm always a little bit let down by like, oh, I punted like a scrub. I guess I'm a scrub.
But I think there's another challenge, which is just that Cube is not one format. It's like this weird format cluster, so it makes it really hard to talk about how to be a good Cube player unless you're, in the context of how do you draft the Magic Online Vintage Cube or whatever. But this is a great topic that touches all cubes, right? Or at least a big enough variety that it makes sense to talk about as a Cube play topic.
Yeah, I actually have some of the numbers on the distribution of non-basic lands in cubes across Cube Cobra, and without fail, like all but I think 2% of them are above the average number of non-basic lands available in Retail Limited. So even cubes that are relatively very low fixing, in the bottom 10% of cubes with fixing lands, they still have more than Retail Limited sets do on average. So this is, I think, something that does apply pretty much across the spectrum of most cubes without weird rules, restrictions, and stuff. But first, before we get to that great topic, we are going to do a pack one, pick one from a listener-submitted cube. And this week's cube comes to us from listener Tristan, and she has submitted her 540 card. It's technically a vintage cube, I suppose, but she describes it as a modern cube with a little bit of legacy spice dripped in, and it's designed to play some of the most traditional, powerful cards in Modern and Legacy and be nice and fair with all the colors evenly matched. I'm going to read the pack, and we are going to talk about what we're going to pick. The pack is Lightning Helix, Breeding Pool, Mishra's Factory, Dermotaxi, Riptide Laboratory, Opt, Sarkin the Masterless, Dramoka's Cavern, Flicker Wisp, Baral Chief of Compliance, Sleight of Hand, Sphinx of the Steel Wind, Blade Splicer, Ripjaw Raptor, and Goblin Bushwhacker. Anthony, what are you taking from this pack?
I think this is pretty straightforward. We've got a beautiful Esper card in the Sphinx of the Steel Wind, and we have a 3-color Esper land. We're here talking about fixing. We're going to wheel that layer and win the draft.
I think you will wheel the layer.
I think so.
Are you going to use it to cast that 8-drop?
The layers don't actually work great for casting 8-drops.
I would argue lands don't work great for casting 8-drops in most Magic.
Yeah, that's fair. I think for me, it's between Opt, Sarkin the Masterless, and Blade Splicer, with a special consideration for Breeding Pool. I kind of like just like big red cards sometimes. Sometimes I just want to try that out. I think it can be surprisingly effective. Inferno Titans and Sarkins are just very powerful cards. So I think that's a reasonable way to actually jump into a new cube. But I think I'm leaning towards Opt.
Yeah, I want to give credit to Tristan here. I think this pack, as stated in the cube goals, very evenly power level across the board. There's nothing standing out to me as a huge power level outlier. And, maybe like Riptide Lab or Dermotaxi are on the low end of the power spectrum. And I'm kind of imagining what the deck might look like that can really abuse those cards. But overall, these cards seem universally playable and nothing jumps out as like, oh, I got to take this first. So I agree that I'm actually somewhat considering Breeding Pool here. I usually don't like to take just 2-color fixing lands as a first pick. Now, I'll be very happy to first pick a City of Brass or a fetch land, which can fix for many different combinations of colors. But a Breeding Pool, if I'm not playing exactly green and exactly blue, or, one of them and splashing the other, this card does nothing for me. So it is effectively first picking a gold card. But the rest of the pack is evenly distributed enough that I'm very happy to prioritize fixing for reasons we'll touch on perhaps later in this episode. I agree with your top 3 cards. That's actually the top 3 I picked out as well, with Mishra's Factory thrown into the mix, I think, a little bit too.
Yeah, that's pretty reasonable. Like, if you're looking at Goblin Bushwhacker or Blade Splicer and you're thinking, I'm probably going to draft an aggressive deck, starting with an excellent colorless aggressive card that gives you the flexibility to go into either red or white or potentially a different color is a good solid start.
Yeah, it's a colorless card, which is what I like about it, and it's really good. Like, I feel like this card does not get talked about often because it's been around forever, but the fact that this is just a colorless land that for 1 mana attacks as a 2/2 or blocks as a 3/3 is very, very strong. So that's also up there for me. You gave your short list, but what is the actual pick going to be for you?
I think today I'm feeling Opt. I wouldn't fault anyone for choosing any of those, though.
I'm going to take the Factory, I think.
Okay.
For me, it's between the Factory and the Breeding Pool, which I think will segue nicely into our conversation about lands and mana bases in Cube. Thank you, Tristan, for sending in your cube. If you want to have your cube on Lucky Paper Radio, send us your cube link. your name and pronouns to mail@luckypaper.co, and we will do a pack one, pick one from it at some point. We'll get around to them all eventually.
Are we going to talk about the lairs later in this episode, or should we touch on it really briefly while
If
we're
you
looking
want to talk
at it?
layers, let's talk about them right now.
The only thing I would say is that they're a little bit better than they look because they give you the untapped mana the turn they come in.
You're going to have to go ahead and read the rules text of the layers so people know what we're talking about
Oh, of
here.
course. So Dromar's Cavern, this is the Esper layer, or maybe Dromar is the OG Esper and we should just be calling things.
Hearing you say the word Dromar's Cavern makes me think when I read the pack I said Dromoka's Cavern. Did I?
You might have.
Well, we'll find out. We'll find out when I end the show. Dromoka's Cavern. Dromoka's Cavern. Dromoka's Cavern. Go!
Dromar's Cavern is a lair in addition to other types, so that I think would be Oracle texted to just have land. Lair in the type line, it comes into play, sacrifice unless you return a non-lair land you control to its owner's hand, and it taps for white, blue, and black. So it's...
Or doesn't tap for all three. White or blue or black.
I wish it was, a triple bounce land.
That'd be pretty good.
So it's not a bounce land like the Ravnica bounce lands, which generate 2 mana. So even though they make you pick up a land, they still the next turn you have as much mana as you would expect to from playing a land per turn. This actually does put you down a mana, but you can tap the land that you're using that you're going to pick up, which means on the turn you play it, it doesn't put you down a mana compared to the bounce lands. So I think these do have a place if you have like a fairly low curving environment where you're playing lots of colors. They actually can make some sense.
Yeah, and they have the same kinds of upsides that the bounce lands do in that if you want to retrigger landfall, if you have
Also
lands
true,
with triggered abilities when they enter the battlefield, you can, reset those things if you want. So they definitely have some interesting upside and design space when you're putting them in cubes. But Anthony, we're not talking about design in this episode. We are talking about drafting and building mana bases. I broke the subject down into 3 high-level topics. And the first is just how highly should you draft lands? In a nutshell, Anthony, how would you describe how you approach fixing lands when you're drafting a cube? How highly do you take them relative to the cards in the rest of the cube, given that all cubes are relative to the cards that are within them?
I don't know how to structure that answer better than just highly. I would say definitely if I'm... So I guess here's maybe the easiest baseline. If we're comparing to retail limited, almost every card in a cube is pretty playable. They tend to have much more even power levels where it's like by passing, the best card in the pack, it doesn't mean, and taking a land, I'm not getting something that's kind of a junker in the next pack that's like cutting out an actual playable. I'm going to end up with enough playables, so drafting fixing just means I get to end up with a lot more cards that I have drafted into my deck and increasing its overall power level. If I know the colors I'm in, then it's some of the highest picks. I'll just take a 2-color land. If I'm playing blue-red, I'll take a blue-red land over almost anything, right? But early in the draft, I do think that the question is a lot more complicated.
Yeah, you touched on a lot of things I think are really important to this question. Like you said, I think retail limited is really the only comparison point we have. It's the only baseline that we can attach this discussion to. And in retail limited, mana fixing is so bad across the board. Like every deck's mana is so shaky and unreliable that even a really strong fixing land in your colors, let's say it's pack 3, you're blue-red, you open a Steam Vents, like one of the best fixing lands. I think in most limited environments, you can't afford to take that over somewhat premium removal, a really strong uncommon, like any B or higher card. I think you just have to take the B or higher card than the fixing most of the time, because really what it comes down to when you're drafting these cards is the value of your pick over replacement, over whatever would be that card if you didn't take that pick. And like you said, in Cube, it's a pretty universal design goal of most Cube designers that they not have a bunch of stinkers in their Cube. Now, obviously, there are things that can contribute to a card being a stinker sometimes, like if you have a bunch of combo decks and narrow archetypes where even if you're in a particular color pair, you might get an on-color card that doesn't fit with your strategy. But for the most part, you don't have all that extra noise that comes in a retail booster pack of cards designed for other formats and cards designed for flavor and all the other considerations they have. And
just the power level variety, which is intentional to the design of making limited fun of a rare versus an uncommon versus a common.
Right, exactly. So because you're going to pick 45 cards, and as much as possible, those picks are going to be on color. You'll have some, incidental picks you won't have any control over, which will dilute that pool a little bit. But you're taking 45 cards, and you really only need somewhere between 23 and 25, 23 and 26 non-land cards in your deck at the end of the day to make a deck. You have a big buffer there of cards that are not going to make that non-land cut to the best 25 non-land cards in your pool. And those picks are much better to be used on non-basic lands that will improve your mana, make your whole deck better, and their replacement is a basic land, as opposed to their replacement being the next best card in the cube you could be playing. Like, Lightning Bolt is a lot better than Shock, but having a Shock and a Steam Vents in your deck might be better than having a Lightning Bolt and just another mountain.
Hard to say, but
I know it's somewhat condensed, but
yeah, hopefully it goes without saying we're going to try and provide as much context to all these as possible, because cube is a varied thing, and you'll hopefully be able to take that and understand when these things are no longer true.
Right. To me, the summary of how highly to draft lands is very highly, and it's because of that value over replacement question. When you're looking at a pack and you're saying, "Ooh, I'd really like this removal spell. I'd like to have a couple more removal spells." How likely, when you get to the end of the draft, is that removal spell going to be your 20th, 21st, 22nd card, where it's good, but you have a 24th, 25th, 26th card, which you could sub in at very little cost to you, and the advantage of having another dual land instead of another basic is a pretty big advantage. So that's the main draw. Obviously, the type of fixing does matter. I like to think it doesn't. Like, if you took my cube, which right now has around about 60 fixing lands, I have 2 cycles of fetches, 3 cycles of shock lands, and then 10 other fixing lands like Horizon lands and City of Brasses and stuff. And if you took all those cards out of my cube and just subbed in 6 guild gates for each color pair, people would take lands a lot less highly, me included, I think, in the cube. With mana fixing, it does kind of matter what your play groups or what the table's valuation of those cards are, because it's something that most decks are going to want, and there is a lot of that effect in most cubes. I mean, obviously, 60 is a pretty high amount of fixing lands for a 360-card cube, but even if I only had 40, that's way more than I have burn spells, removal spells, ramp creatures. Like, in terms of classes of cards, there's a lot of fixing to go around. Everyone's going to want some of it, and if you know at a certain table you can get it mid-pack or late, you might not have to prioritize it, which is kind of a weird meta question that invalidates any heuristic we could possibly provide about how to take lands.
Right, there's sort of a weird feedback loop where if everybody takes lands pretty lowly in a certain pod, then if you are taking them too much higher than everyone else, you'll end up with actually just all lands. You won't have a deck. So just figuring out how to evaluate them compared to the rest of the players at the table is actually an aspect of it. But I think that overall in most cubes that I've played, the answer is people value them highly, and you need to take them highly.
I feel like one of the things we learned when friend of the show, John, had the Cultic Cube on MTGO, one of the things that came out of that environment is that John had a higher density of fixing and broke Singleton for fetch lands, I think just fetch lands in the Cultic Cube. And as a result, I think a lot of people took their heuristics about how highly to take lands in the regular Magic Online Vintage Cube and said, well, there's a lot more to go around, so I'll take them a lot less highly. And everyone did that. And so you could actually take them less highly because so many people had gotten this message of oh, there's a lot of fixing here, so I will just not prioritize it. And that was an interesting kind of weird meta thing. I mean, it's
so
funny.
You're saying everything just kind of worked out?
Well, it's just funny that any observation or lesson we could give about playing a cube is entirely dependent on the other people that are playing it.
Right. So
entirely
not just the context
of
the cube itself, but the context of who you're playing it with.
Right. For example, you should probably, if you had not cut Thassa's Oracle from your cube, you should probably maybe even consider hate drafting it. But if no one knows to draft Trade Routes and Thassa's Oracle in the Turbo Cube, then it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. It's this meta layer thing that can kind of make all these discussions somewhat irrelevant. But that caveat aside, take lands highly. All right, let's move on to how to build a mana base in your deck. You've done the draft. You've taken lands highly. You've read the table. You've responded to the meta, and you've ended up with a fair amount of fixing lands. How do you decide how to actually build that mana base? The first question I want to pose to you is that we hear often in the limited world that 17 lands is the baseline. That's the inherited wisdom from Retail Limited, so much so there's even a whole analytic website named after it. Is 17 your baseline for building mana bases in cube decks?
17 is still my baseline, but I'm going to make some caveats on that. And I think ultimately, if you're going to tell me 16 or 15 lands is actually optimal, I will believe you for the reasons you will explain.
I have no idea what's actually optimal. I'll tell you what I do, but I got no idea what's optimal, buddy.
But I really don't like getting mana screwed, as many players will feel the same way. So I definitely, as a baseline, in most cubes, will still start with 17. The reason why I think that probably tends to being too many lands is that, like you're saying, with a limited deck, you have bad mana as an assumption. You have 9.
It's worth noting that, sorry to interrupt, but bad mana is relative to constructed.
That's so
obviously.
true.
Like
Yeah.
everyone's mana is bad, so it doesn't matter.
So nobody's mana is bad. It's
right,
just the same.
everyone's
That's
mana
the
is
way
just
the game
mana.
works.
But when we look at constructed Magic, where players get to get a much greater degree of control over their decks and their mana bases, we see a much, much, much higher density of fixing. So the amount of fixing players have decided is requisite to cast their spells based on their definition of reliably is much higher than is available to them in retail limited. So that's what we mean when we say that limited mana is bad.
Very true. So I think part of the issue there, though, is that, or some of the like motivating factors are, if I'm playing a green-white deck, I might not actually need 17 lands to be able to hit my third land on turn 3 often enough to play optimally, but I do need to make sure I draw both a plains and a forest, which really motivates you to play a lot more lands than you quote-unquote need. Whereas if you have a bunch of dual lands in a 2-color deck in Cube, you can potentially lower that number quite a bit, so you still have the number of sources required to cast your spells of any individual color without increasing the total number of lands.
Yeah. So for me, my baseline now for cube decks is 16. I will start with the assumption I'm going to do 16 land deck in every cube I draft. Your cube, my cube, even though our cubes are pretty different in terms
Bold
of power
and fair.
level and pretty different in terms of speed, I will still start there. And I more often go lower than I go up to 17. Very rarely do I go up to 17 for some reason. That does happen. Like if I didn't get good mana fixing in the draft, I ended up with a deck with more high mana value cards, or whatever the reason. I'm playing a control deck with very few cantrips or something. I will go higher, but there's a lot of good reasons to end up going lower. And those reasons are like, if I'm playing a really low curving aggro deck, my fourth land is a dead draw. I just don't want to draw it ever. And I'm fine being stuck on 2 or even 1 land for a couple turns. Like there are definitely decks I've drafted in cubes where that's fine. Like I have an opening hand with like 4 1-drops. And so I'll keep a 1 land hand that can cast 4 of its cards because I'll still get to do things and commit to the board, and drawing that second land can come, later on. Or, being stuck on 2 is totally fine because that casts 85% of the cards in my deck or something. So that's one reason. Another reason is if your deck is full of card advantage, especially very cheap card advantage and cantrips. If you get to just churn through your deck very quickly, you can use those cantrips in the early game to find additional lands when you need to make your land drops. And then in late game, you're essentially drawing from a better deck because you don't want to draw lands in the late game and your deck started with fewer lands in it. And so all of your late game draws are inherently a bit better because you've shaved lands a little bit to fill your deck with cantrips, but they can still help you find those lands when you need them. And the way to think about that for me, I really ignore anything that's 2 mana and above. Like if it's 2 mana draw a card, I don't really count that towards shaving down my lands just because it costs so much more mana to get there. But if it costs 1 mana and it draws a card, I will basically use that as subtracting a card from my deck size. So I'll say, actually, I'm playing a 39 card deck, or 38 card deck, or 35 card deck, or 34 card deck, and use that as my baseline for figuring out lands if I have a lot of cheap cantrips. And what that basically works out to is that if you have 2 to 3 cheap cantrips, you can shave a land because, your lands are going to be a third-ish of your deck. And so once you have 2 to 3 cheap cantrips, you've made your deck 1 land smaller. You can just kind of keep following that rough heuristic as you shave down. I have a lot of cantrips in my cube, but even my most cantrip dense decks rarely end up with more than 6 1-mana cantrips. That's a lot. And so I'm not really going lower than 15 lands, 14 lands, rarely within a Xerox style deck. But that's kind of how I arrive at that. And the other reason to go lower than 16, which is again my baseline, is lots of 1-mana ramp, like mana dorks, because those are also mana sources. Like that is not a land. It doesn't have land in the type line. You might miss your land drop, but if you have 5, 6 1-mana mana dorks in your deck, or other very cheap forms of mana sources like Mox Diamonds, Chrome Moxes, that kind of stuff, those have essentially performed the role of lands. And so you can have cheap cards like that, and with only a couple lands, you can still develop your mana. Now, very oftentimes, those ramp creatures, especially the mana dorks, end up in decks that not only want to play early mana dork, but also want to hit their 3rd and 4th land drops because they're trying to ramp to higher mana value spells. And even if your elf is a mana source, and it is, if you paid for the elf on turn 3 and then turn 4 you don't have a land drop, it might as well have just been a tap land. You essentially paid to put a bad land into play if that's what you're trying to go to do. So if you're ramping to higher mana value spells, the value of those ramp creatures in terms of cutting down your land count, I think, diminishes.
Yeah, I think that the important thing that you're sort of getting at there is that the deck you're playing also really matters, both like how many lands you're playing and ultimately
There's
what
so many
kinds.
factors.
Because, if you're playing a very aggressive deck, you want even less lands because you can't make use of the later land draws. I don't totally agree. I think that there is a big difference between the kind of like blue draw spells that you're talking about, which are cheap cantrips, versus other more expensive sources of card advantage, where in a lot of environments, I will actually want to go up in lands if I have a lot of draw spells. Imagine like divinations or like more expensive draw multiple card spells, because I am going to have a bunch of cards in hand. I want to make sure I'm actually hitting my land drop so that I can deploy these bigger threats.
Yeah. The cantrips don't inherently mean you can cut down lands. It also depends on what the rest of your deck is doing. If you're going to cast cantrips because you want to then draw enough lands to hard cast your 7 drops, that's going to affect how you build your mana base as well. Like if you're just playing... What's the big Kiora Best the Sea God? If you're playing some cube where you're playing a control deck, Kiora Best the Sea God is your win condition. You have no ramp. You're just planning to play to the long game. You're going to want a lot of lands in that deck, because even if you have a bunch of cantrips, you need to draw 7 lands, or it's 7 drop, right? It's not 8.
I believe so.
I think it's 5 blue. So it really, like, every aspect of your deck affects even the simple question of how many lands do you play. So everything we talked about, but also the question of, like you said, sometimes your mana curve doesn't dictate that you need more than 15 or 16 lands, but you're playing a 2-color deck and your mana fixing is a little bit sus, and so you need enough sources of your 2 colors to cast all your spells on time, and that means you got to play a couple more lands than maybe you'd want to. So that's another factor. Also, it just depends on how fast the environment is. How punished are you for being off on your mana for a couple turns? And that is, I think, a distinct question to what the mana curves look like, because as we've established, you can have a environment with very low mana curves, like for example the turbo cube, where half the cube costs essentially 0. You can still have very grindy games in that environment. That can still be an environment where it's not super fast, and so that's a separate question. How fast is the environment? How punished are you by missing your mana? So all of these things, really, I mean, most of the cards in your deck are going to affect how many lands you need to play. It's not an incredibly simple question, but my baseline is 16 these days, just because I found so many decks I want to go 16 or lower. And I feel like 17 is kind of a fail case for me. I'll end up at 17 if something went really wrong in my draft and I'm making a greedy splash and my fixing's not good, or whatever the reasons are, I'll end up there. But 16 is my baseline, and I often go lower. I've gone as low as like 12 in an aggro deck. It's happened before. If I have like, a Luris aggro deck with all 1 and 2 drops, and it's like I don't need my 3rd land for most of the game, then I think you can go super, super low sometimes.
I think in addition to the deck strategy and plan in the environment, the type of lands you're playing also matters. So specifically in my cube, which is much lower power, we have all the bounce lands. So enter the battlefield, you have to pick up another land.
Yeah, it's a great
point. And those are basically just like drawing 2 lands, right?
Yeah, it is.
So I will happily, this is one of my favorite parts about this cube, really. It's like, it's a fair amount slower than a lot of the vintage and legacy cubes, but the fact that you can then just say like, well, I've got 3 bounce lands, I'm just going to play 15 lands and it's going to be great. And I'm sometimes going to get horribly punished for it, but it's that's a lot of fun. I also really
it's
like
rare,
things...
though. I think it is optimal. Like we could joke about being punished by it. It can happen where you draw all your bounce lands or something, but 3 bounce lands in a 15 land deck is basically an 18 mana source deck, right? Because every bounce land counts for 2 mana sources pretty much.
And lands that, in the other direction, are mana sinks, so things like the Horizon lands that sacrifice to draw a card, or man lands that serve as a mana sink. I think those can also be ways to sort of mitigate flood in a different way, and if you are interested in casting your spells and want to run more lands, can enable that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I've got notes here later on about how utility lands oftentimes, I don't even really count as a full land slot. Like if I have a wasteland or a creature land or some of the modal double face cards that have lands on the back, spells on the front, I'll kind of count that as like half a land towards my land count.
Totally.
Because it's like, if I'm just going to play my wasteland and immediately waste your land most games, then it's not really a land in my deck, right? And it has the fail case of like, all right, I actually am stuck on lands. I need to use my wasteland as a waste for a turn, and then later on I can actually use it to disrupt my opponent. But I kind of count that as like half a land source when I'm doing these things. Let's talk about what counts as a mana source, Anthony. So, obviously lands, Dark Depths excluded, are mana sources, right?
Yes.
That's not a trick question.
I was trying.
You're thinking how is he trying to trick me? I'm not trying to trick you.
No, I was trying to bring in the mana sources were eroded out of the game in 4th edition or whatever joke.
Looking for some joke. So lands definitely count, and the colors they produce obviously really counts here too, right? Like a Sacred Foundry is a red source and a white source. A Plains is just a white source. A Mishra's Factory is a colorless source, which is all worth considering. I also count cards with like no or very minimal cost that go get lands as mana sources. So like fetch lands don't produce mana, but they, for just a life, go get a mana source out of your deck and put it into play. Similarly, Evolving Wilds, Ash Barrens, which Ash Barrens does cost a mana. You have to pay a mana into it, so it does have a minimal cost, but it's a small enough cost that I'm willing to just count that as a mana source, right? Like Ash Barrens just, goes in my deck and gets me whatever I need. And I think in slower environments, you can also count cards with like basic land cycling for 2. Where I'm gonna basic land cycle my Timeless Dragon. I will count the Timeless Dragon as a mana source in a lot of decks. If the cube's really fast, maybe not. Like if your main plan is not to basic land cycle, if that's a fail case, then maybe you don't want to count that as a mana source. That's kind of on the fringe, but everything else totally counts. I also count cards that just produce mana of the given source but aren't lands. Mana Dorks, Mana Rocks, Rampant Growths. Like that's to me also a mana source if I have Rampant Growths, things like that. Once you can start getting to 3+ mana, though, I stop counting them as mana sources for the purposes of mana-based calculation. So if I'm playing a cube that plays Cultivates and Kodama's Reaches and Coalition Relics, those kinds of things, to me that's enough of a cost that I will think about them for a splash, because splashes are often cards you're happy to play in the late game. You don't have to play them on curve. But for the purposes of figuring out my mana base, which is going to be how I'm going to cast my primary colors of spells on curve, I don't count things that cost that much mana, because it just is too much resources to invest to basically be waiting on that to resolve to cast the cards in my hand to get my mana fixed.
Right. I think that what that number is going to be environment dependent, but
right.
3 is probably a reasonable baseline.
It's a big jump between 2 and 3, and a big jump between 1 and 2.
Right. You already need your mana already needs to work if you're casting your 3 or 4 mana ramp spell.
Right. So I count all those things as mana sources. Again, in my environment, I'm kind of on the fence about things that cost 2 mana. So like Rampant Growths and basic land cycling for 2 generic mana. I'm like, yeah, it's kind of a mana source, but a little bit of a shaky one. And things that cost 1 mana, I totally count. Mana Dorks, that kind of stuff, just get in there. That's a mana source.
Do you think we've counted all the mana sources?
What else is there?
I would also definitely say things like Abundant Harvest and Once Upon a Time you could potentially count as a mana source.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I count Once Upon a Time as a land in my land counts. We've talked about how something like Oath of Nissa is an interesting card in that it counts as a mana source just for planeswalkers, kind of. Or not a mana source, but it fixes your mana just for planeswalkers. Mm-hmm. So it basically counts as another colored source. Doesn't affect your land count, but will affect your, like, how many red sources do I have, how many blue sources do I have in your deck, but just for your planeswalker spells.
Right. But there is a big difference in those, even though I think it is legitimate to count those, for the purposes of evaluating deck as a mana source. Anything that is colored that you're treating as a mana source still has a cost that you want to make sure that is, the color you're more likely to have early in the game.
Right. So then we arrive at the all-important question, which I think is the real crux of this discussion, which is how many mana sources do you need of each color? And here we are luckily standing on the shoulders of giants, and the giant is named Frank Karsten, who has written the definitive article on how many mana sources you need in your deck to cast your spells reliably. We'll link this in the show notes. It's also very easy to find by Googling. This article has been updated numerous times throughout the years as different kinds of mana costs have come out, and Frank has updated his math on them. And basically it just says, if you're trying to cast a card that costs, 1 in a color or 2 in 2 colors, like 2 in 2 pips, like a Wrath of God, here's how many sources you need in a deck of this size to cast that spell reliably. Now, importantly, all of these numbers are completely dependent on Frank Karsten's definition of reliably. And so if you want to dive into that to really understand how he's arriving at these numbers, you can read the article and get into it. For my purposes, I'm going to trust Frank. I'm going to trust that he's basically done the work here. And it's worth noting that these numbers are primarily made, I think, with constructed in mind, because again, in limited, you don't have the luxury of being able to, in retail limited, draft anything anywhere near what Frank would define as a reliable, good mana base. And so I think he provided the 40 card numbers because it's easy enough to just run the numbers of 40 cards, and some people do care. Really, those numbers are basically just for cube, though, because you can't ever have that many mana sources in War of the Spark or in Adventures in the Forgotten Realms to make your 2-color deck really tick. It just doesn't happen. There's not enough non-basic lands floating around. So, the summary of this, and everyone should go read this article, or at least check out the table. The table is really, really useful. And here's the part of it I have committed to basically to memory, which is that single pip cards, so like a 1-drop in a given color, in order to cast on time, according to Frank, in a 40-card deck, you need 10 sources of a given color, which to me is just one of the most condensed ways to explain why 2-color aggro decks are notoriously difficult to make work. Because if you have 1-drops in 2 colors, you're playing a red-black aggro deck with Knight of the Ebon Legion and Ragavan. If you want to be able to reliably, on turn 1, cast either of these cards, whichever one's in your opening hand, you're going to need 10 sources of black and red, and you're already in an aggro deck, which is a deck that notoriously wants to shave lands. So you're looking at needing 6, 7, 8 dual lands before you approach anything that Frank would consider a reliable mana base, and that's not even counting any additional utility lands you have. Aggro decks are very often the ones that most want wastelands or most want other creature lands, so that's why it's very difficult to do. But basically, 10 pips for single cost cards. Cards that are 1 in a color, so Tarmogoyf, those kinds of cards, you want 9 sources of that color. 2 in a color, you want 8 sources. Obviously, because you're on curve, you still need that 1 color, but having it by turn 2, you want 9 sources. Having it by turn 3, you want 8 sources. And then the last ones I'll think about are 1 CC cards. So this is your Seasoned Pyromancer is a 1 CC card. And 2 CC cards, like Wrath of God, require 12 and 11 sources. So we're getting up to really high numbers now. And how I summarize all of this, like the only part I have stored in my head when I'm actually doing deck building is that I want between 9 and 11 sources of each color in my deck for my main colors, my primary colors. So if I'm a 2-color deck splashing, we ignore the splash for a second, and I say I really want to shoot for between 9 and 11 sources of each of those colors, which if you're building a 16-land mana base means you're going to have 4 or 5 duels to try and get to those numbers.
Yeah, I think that follows my intuition. I think the biggest thing or question there is, I guess 2 questions, actually. If I'm playing a 2-color proactive deck with a lot of cheap spells, do I need to be able to cast all of my spells reliably? Because sometimes if I draw my plains and my white spell and my mountain and my red spell, like I can do one of those things until the next turn where hopefully I draw a different source. So maybe there's a little bit of wiggle room there just in terms of not looking at how often can you cast a particular spell, but cast any spell.
Right, and that's why I'm so grateful for all the math work
Right.
Frank has done, because he's done all that, right? To say, like, all right, how many hands in my 2-color proactive deck do I have my red 1-drops and my white lands, and my white lands and my red 1-drops, and how often do I have my dual land and both, and so I can just cast whatever I want. And all that is kind of baked into the mana base math that Frank has done there. So that's what I'm aiming for most of the time. And some cubes, the amount of lands they have won't really allow that, and to me, I'm always aware, like, okay, I'm a little below where I want to be, and that will affect things like how willing I am to splash a card, how willing I am to play a colorless land that has some utility that might make my mana base a little bit worse. But that's just something I'm keeping in mind, is I always want to be between 9 and 11 sources of each of my primary colors. For a splash, I have a little flexibility here. Now, this gets into the whole ideology of, like, what do you consider a splash? Like, if I'm playing a green-red, mid-range deck, even a proactive one, I'm not going to splash Thoughtseize in that deck. Even though Thoughtseize is only 1 black mana, Thoughtseize is at its best on turn 1. So to me, that's not a splashable card. And so I wouldn't look at the amount of sources I need to cast Thoughtseize and try and figure out how to splash it, because it's just not really going to work. Similarly, even if the card costs more mana, so like, for example, take that same green-red deck, now I want to splash a Heartless Act. Heartless Act is a card I don't necessarily need to cast on curve for it to be good. And those are the cards I'm excited about splashing. So Harvest Act is a removal spell, 1 in a black to destroy a creature unless it has counters on it, take the counters off if it has counters on it. That's a much more splashable card, and even though Frank dictates in his mana base math that I would want 9 black sources in my deck to cast that Heartless Act reliably, that's reliably on curve.
Right. I think that's really the key thing is what does reliably mean for different kinds of cards? Or like,
Right.
how does that apply where you want your proactive cards to be cast on curve, but your splash card, hopefully if you've made a reasonable choice in the kinds of cards you're splashing, they are things that don't need to be cast reliably on curve.
Exactly. And so because of that, my heuristic in my head is just that I want like 6 to 7 sources to be happy splashing a card. And that means that I'm really not planning to actually cast that card until turn 4 or later, because that's when I can somewhat reasonably expect to have found that source of that color for that splash. So, in summary, when I'm looking at my mana sources, 9 to 11 of my core colors, 6 to 7 for a splash is generally what I'm looking to do with most of my decks.
Your taste for good mana is high.
I really like casting my spells, Anthony. I do not like losing because I did not draw my other source of mana.
I definitely wouldn't go quite that high. I feel like for a splash, I'm generally maybe more comfortable with 3 or 4 sources.
That's what I've heard from like limited resources. I
Mhm.
think I've definitely heard, LSV and Marshall talk about how in retail limited, if you have a card good enough to splash, you got some bomb in pack 3
We're
or something.
talking a 1 pip.
Right,
Splash.
exactly. Always 1 pip with a splash. You got your Orcus late in your black-white deck or something. And there I agree with him. Like there I'm happy to like play my 2 mountains and my 1 dual land, or 2 mountains and 2 treasure-making cards and play that Orcus.
But critically
and get
not
there.
just saying, okay, I'm going to take my 2-color deck and I'm not going to cut 2 lands of each color. Like, I need other sources that are not cutting down on the sources of my main colors.
That is more a byproduct of the shakiness of limited mana bases and the general acceptance of stumbling a bit on casting your spells in retail limited that I think doesn't hold up in most cubes. And so
yeah,
I will
think
not splash a
I
card
think
in
people
cube with just 3
do
sources.
Still stumble in cubes, and perfect mana is not like, I think as a cube designer, I don't design thinking every deck should have perfect mana. Otherwise, I would just say, yeah, all lands
Not a
cap for all.
design discussion. We're doing the player discussion. I
All
want
right.
my deck to have perfect mana if I'm playing.
I want my deck to have perfect mana, but also sometimes I want to splash some cards.
It's fun to splash cards. I will not deny that. I want to talk briefly about monocolored decks, which are not completely free from this discussion either, because those are the decks that I'm very often going super low on my land count total. So I think I've mentioned I've played a couple 12 land decks in my day in cubes. Those are always monocolored decks, because even if you take fixing super highly, you're not going to get enough dual lands to make a 12 land mana base work if you're playing multiple colors of spells. But if you're playing mono white or mono red aggro or something, you can sometimes go super duper low. And this is where those mana sources come into play again, because again, these are the decks that I think also most want Mutavault, Wasteland, Strip Mine, Mishra's Factory, these kinds of utility lands that don't produce colored mana. And so in my monocolored decks, I always want 12 sources of whatever my mana is. And that's, a little higher than my baseline for a 2-colored deck. And so if I'm down to 15 lands or 14 lands and I've got 3 colorless lands, that will make me go up my land count or cut one of those colorless lands, because I'm not going to 11 or 10 colored sources in my monocolored deck. It's just too low.
Yeah, it sounds pretty reasonable. Obviously, there's also, pip consideration. If you have a lot of Eidolon and the Great Revel or other double pip cards, you want to be extra careful about splashing those colorless lands.
Yep.
Yeah, and
sure.
maybe even going to the point of thinking as those colorless lands are the splash.
Yeah, for sure. That's one way to think of it. And so this comes down to like, all right, so how do we actually count these lands then when we're looking at our mana sources? And for me, I mentioned these, I count these as like half lands sometimes. And in reality, when I oftentimes look at a deck, I'm always kind of on the fence. I'm like, well, this is either a 14 land or a 15 land deck, or it's a 15 land deck or a 16 land deck. And so I will use those colorless lands or the modal double face cards or things like that as kind of a tiebreaker, where it's like, well, I think I'm on the fence, so I'll make that last land a modal double face card. And then it's like kind of half a land. And that's how I end up justifying those kinds of last bit of inclusions. If there's no math there, it's just like, if I feel like if I've got my sources at 14 and I'm, just shy of having the source I want for my splash at 15, maybe that modal double face card can be that last source to kind of like tie the whole room together and, give me the right land count and the right source breakdown for the deck I'm playing.
Is it worth mentioning just briefly, there's a lot of great math that we can do, and we're really grateful to Frank Carson for giving us this awesome resource.
Thanks, Franks.
However, we're not sitting down and pulling out this chart on our phone every time we're building a deck. Like, these are some heuristics that we can, after a draft review, see how things felt, and use this as a baseline to actually try and just like correct our own intuition. But ultimately, the goal is to, at least for me, and maybe for you as well, is to like build these heuristics into your intuition and develop as a player that way.
You've perfectly touched on my third section of my notes here, which is,
Wow.
okay, we've talked about all the math, we've talked about all this theory and high-level stuff behind the mana bases, but what do you actually do when you sit down at a table, you finish your draft, and you have to figure out this puzzle in a few minutes while you're building your deck in a reasonable amount of time? I have my list here of what I actually do when I'm building a deck. Can you describe your actual process of like, all right, you've made your cuts or whatever, you've got your deck down, how do you decide how many basics to get of each?
So when I'm drafting, I'm always, if we're drafting in paper, we're not playing competitive REL. We can look at our picks as we're going. I'm always building my deck as I go. And once I sort of figure out what colors I'm in, I'm ordering it by CMC. And I'm definitely really thinking about at what point in the curve are cards of different colors. And I think that's a big factor that goes into, what I end up playing. Like, because making sure I have enough basics or, enough mana sources of the color of my early drops is really important. And especially also thinking about in terms of like what cards I'm drafting. If I'm thinking, well, I'm drafting this pretty proactive red-white deck, but I have more white than red, I'm much more willing to take like a burn spell or something that has more meaning in the late game in my sort of like secondary color. So I often sort of have pretty specific expectations about what my mana base is going to look like going into it. And then I sort of stack up the 2 colors or whatever and kind of go by intuition.
Yeah, I think that's what most people do. It's kind of a gut check. My brain is a little... I do more stuff in my head. So first of all, interestingly, I don't resort the cards when I'm drafting, except for maybe very late in pack 3. Because for me, when I'm looking at that pile of the cards I've already drafted, I keep them very carefully in the order I drafted them, because a big part of why I'm reviewing the pile is like, when did I actually get that card? Because I'm trying to figure out the signals in the mid-pack.
Interesting.
And then very late in pack 3 or something, I might say, all right, finally, now I'm not playing these 3 colors or whatever, and I'm just going to start stacking them up by type and mana value. But really, really late in pack 3, usually not until the draft is over. So the first thing I do, before I even start looking at like my pool and what non-land cards I'm going to play, is just a quick gut check on my fixing. Is it good, bad, or in the middle? Like, did I get the fixing I wanted? Did I not? Or am I somewhere in between? Because that will dictate how I think about the non-land cards I'm playing. Will I try and play these 2 1 CC cards in different colors at 3 mana, right next to each other? Or will I be explicitly trying to cut down on the more narrow or demanding casting costs in one of my colors because I know my mana is a little bit light? So I'll do that first. Then I'll build the deck, cut down to like my 25 non-land cards I plan on playing. And I will count the pips of all my non-land cards. So Tarmogoyf counts as 1 green, and a Jadelight Ranger counts as 2 green. I'll just count the pips and add them up. I'll count the sources from my non-basic lands. So how many sources do I have without any basics? Like, how many mana sources do I have of each color? And keep those numbers in my head or write them down on my phone or something. And then the first thing I'll actually do almost all the time is, my first step is adding enough basics to bring me to even distribution of all the mana sources of all the colors in my deck that's playing. So very oftentimes I'll have 5 to 7 or 4 to 7 sources from non-basic lands and from mana dorks and stuff of my colors. And so if I have 5 of my black and 7 of my green, I'll add 3 swamps or whatever, just to bring all of my colors to the same baseline.
Editor's note, 2 swamps. I'll add 2 swamps because 7 minus 5 is 2.
That's how my brain works. I just like to get everything on the same level, where it's like, all right, now my fixing is even across the board. I have the same number of sources of all my colors. And then with whatever room I have left, that's where I skew things. So that's where I say, all right, well, I've already got my splash covered. So I already brought myself to my 7 black sources or whatever. I will not add any swamps now because I've already got the splash taken care of. In this remaining chunk of lands, that's where I'll start to think, all right, how does my deck skew? Is it more one color? Is it more color A than color B? Do I have more 1-drops I need to cast on curve in color A than I do in color B? Is color A green and I have lots of mana fixing in that color, and so I need to hit my green in order for my other mana sources to actually be mana sources of those colors? And with those remaining, it's usually a handful of basics. I would say like it's usually 5 to 8 basics. That's where I end up saying, all right, well, now, even though I'm a 2-color deck, I'm going to take 6 forests and 2 mountains because green is more important for me to get. And that's how I end up kind of working things out after I do a draft. Is that, now that I said it out loud, I worry that's a little bit insane.
That's a little bit of a weird process. But, ever find a process that works for you is maybe the lesson to take.
Well, here's a common mistake I guess I see that is maybe why I do this. I feel like people will often not so consciously count their non-basic land sources. And so they'll just say like, well, I'm more green than I am red. I need more forests than I need mountains. And then not have realized that actually all of their non-basics were forests and very few of them were mountains. And so they take the number of basics that feels like it's the right breakdown based on the color pips in their pool, but they weren't conscious of the fact that actually you had very few sources of this one color in your non-basics. You didn't quite realize it, and so you needed what looks like a very skewed set of basics in order to bring that. So that's why I do that first step.
That's definitely true. I mean, if I'm playing a 2-color deck, obviously I'll like stack up all the non-basic lands as best I can. So it's like, okay, in between, here's all the things that are sharing exactly 2. If I'm splashing for something, I'll put the splash land in the pile with the basic forests or whatever, just so, yeah, I can actually see and take into account. So I think that is really important to take into account, even if you're doing a more straightforward process.
For some reason, for me, the process I described makes perfect sense in my head. And it's so much easier for me to do it in 2 steps, where it's like, all right, how many basics do I need of each source to get me to the same across the board? Whether that's 8 sources or 4 sources based on how deep my non-basic lands are, just get me to that same baseline, and then that remaining space is where I skew everything based on what my deck actually looks like. To me, it's like, if I didn't do that first step, then I have to like be considering 2 things at once. I have to think about both, well, what's my non-basic land breakdown look like, and also what does my deck distribution look like? Whereas if you just get everything into that baseline, then you get to say, all right, with my remaining 8 slots, look at my deck and figure out which cards I need to cast early, which cards I have more in a specific color of, which cards I have double pips of, and just put more of those basics in.
Sure, I can see that.
This is also where all those tiebreakers come into play. Like, oftentimes I'll be like, I really kind of want an extra land here because I want an extra green source, but I don't really want to play 16 lands in this deck because I have a lot of reasons to play a lower land count. That's where that Metal Double Face card is like, boom, perfect. Get in here, Turn Timber Symbiosis. I'm probably playing that already, but if I wasn't, it's like, that's the card that's like, all right, this will give me my 15th and a half land and my additional green source that I feel like I need to have all my green sources, but, make everything nice and easy in terms of the land count.
Makes sense.
Describing that process out loud, I worry that it makes me sound like a bit of a lunatic.
Aren't we all? Especially Magic players.
Probably. What else do you have to say about Manabases?
So I think
We went pretty deep.
We've mostly been talking just about 2-color decks and like 2-color and a splash, but I think that is only a small portion of building, again, depending on the environment, but like a solid 3 and 4 or 5-color mana base is a thing that can happen a lot of times.
Yeah, and to be clear, like, I think everything we said to me still applies. Like, if I'm playing a 3-color deck where none of the colors are a splash, I'm truly a 3-color deck, like a Jund deck or a Teamer deck or something, then I want 9 to 11 sources of all those colors.
Yeah.
I have to take fixing lands really, really highly to get my 9 to 11 to make that happen.
Right.
And oftentimes, what people will call a 5-color deck to me is a 2 or 3-color deck with 2 to 3 splashes.
Absolutely.
And so it's like, all right, I need to have my 9 to 11 green sources and my 9 to 11 white sources for my baseline of this 5-color deck, because that's what I have most of my cheap spells in. That's where I have my ramp and mana fixing. And then I need my 5 to 6, 5 to 7 sources of all these 3 other colors in order to actually manage those splashes effectively.
Right. I think that's a really critical thing where an actual even split of more than 2 colors is really hard to make work in any context. But if you are reframing it as either that this is a splash or just like you have these base colors and you're comfortable with saying that, those secondary colors are things you're happy to play later in the game, then that all sort of, everything we said sort of hangs together, I think, pretty tidily.
The one thing we didn't touch on, which I didn't mention this because I don't have a good answer for how to handle it, is that there's something really tricky about fetch lands and fetchable sources.
I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about fetch lands.
Yeah, I mean, fetch lands I love them. I adore them so much. Every time I play with them, I like them more and more. I'm up to 2 sets in my cube. And what I like about them is obviously all the synergy they have with stuff in the graveyard and landfall and all that crap. I like that they're really strong mana fixing sources. One of my favorite things was pointed out in a video by Jason Waddell, which is just that if you have a cube that is just dual lands of all the dual land colors, right? So let's say you take my cube, I've got 6 dual lands in each color. If you just put 16 vents in there or any dual lands that weren't fetches in there, then your Izzet deck can only ever hope to get 6 fixing lands because all the lands in all the other colors don't help the Izzet deck. But if you add fetch lands, now an Izzet player that wants to prioritize mana fixing can get their dual lands, however many there are left, let's say 3, and they also can get a huge portion of all of those fetch lands. Any fetch land that gets red or blue now becomes an Izzet land for them. And so even though some players I think might see fetch lands and think, oh, fetch lands are good, they make for greedy multicolored decks, one of the things they actually do much better than other dual lands is really make it possible to draft really strong 2-color mana bases, which you just can't do when the dual lands are kind of all just, dual lands instead of fetches.
Right, or, if you want to get really extreme, you draft the Misty Rainforest, and then you draft the green-blue and the green-red dual, and suddenly you can use that to fetch all your colors.
I don't ever try and do that, but when it happens sometimes, you're like, well,
cute.
I guess I'm playing this Arid Mesa in my Golgari deck.
Why not? If it works out.
It can happen. But the thing I actually really want to talk about was that I count fetch lands as sources of whatever colors they fetch, right? So
right. So you're not just looking at the land and saying this doesn't just get a Scalding Tarn doesn't just count as a blue or a red source. It counts as whatever it can fetch in the whole deck. And I mean, same goes for like you mentioned the Eternal Dragon or the Timeless Dragon,
right? That
have plane cycling, which means you can get dual lands in a lot of cubes.
So I will count it as that, but it's not really that all the time. Sometimes it's either a color A or a color B source, but it's not both, and sometimes it's both. Like a dual land is always both. My Azorius Guildgate is always a blue and a white source. If I have a Flooded Strand in a deck with no fetchables, for example, then that is not a white-blue source. That is a white or a blue source. And if you used it on turn 1 to get your blue source to cast your cantrip, you now don't have your white source to cast your white spell unless you have another white land in hand. And that Flooded Strand was a card you counted as a white source. You started the game with a white source in your hand, but you don't have white mana now. I don't have a good way to handle this and to like process it with a heuristic when you're building your deck, other than to say, I really like to have at least one fetchable dual or, triome, if you're doing the tri-land thing, in all of my color combinations. So if I'm playing a 2-color deck, I obviously want my breeding pool in my Simic deck. If I'm playing a teamer deck, I want a breeding pool, a stomping ground, and a steam vents. I don't want 3 breeding pools and 3 steam vents, which in theory doesn't actually change. The fetch vents can all still fetch all the colors, but it does make a difference in terms of fetching both the colors instead of just one or the other. I wish I had a better answer about that, but it's a complexity that comes up sometimes.
I mean, that's what's, again, great about the game is that this complexity is not solved. We have all this awesome data, but at the same time, the game is too complex, and it does come down to human heuristics and instincts.
I guess another maybe more simple example of that is like you're playing some 5-color deck where you're base green, you're splashing 3 colors. You count your rampant growth, you put a basic in of each, you count your rampant growth as all your splash colors, but obviously it can only get one of them. And so if you have 2 of your splash cards in hand, you're going to have to choose which one you want to cast with that rampant growth until you draw your second source of your splash color, which is a much bigger ask.
Right, which especially makes it tricky, you know, if I'm, base, we're base blue-green and we're splashing a couple other things. Something that is just a gold card and shares one of your base colors is still going to be a much easier splash than being off color in both pips, just because you are going to make sure you have to find both of those. And if you're using fetch lands or rampant growths that only get you potentially one of those colors at a time, you can be in a trickier spot. The other thing I think we should mention about fetch lands is the way they function in the draft. And I think this is something that really comes down to what kind of deck you're drafting, and dual lands as well. We talked before about how we usually will treat something that is a dual land as a gold card. So if you're planning on playing a 2-color deck, if that's your expectation in a particular environment, you maybe don't want to start with them super highly because you're not going to play them unless you end up in exactly those colors. Fetch lands, on the other hand, obviously are much more flexible. They're basically hybrid cards, which means if you're touching any of those color pairs, and potentially with all those weird fetch triangles you can do, they actually can be quite flexible, which makes them so powerful early in the draft specifically. I think that does change if your expectation is in a particular environment, you're likely to play more than 2 colors, because then starting with like these effectively gold lands can just mean that you have so much more flexibility to make use of those fetch lands.
That is true. I think we said in our Pack 1 Pick 1 that like, breeding pool is a gold card. If I'm not playing exactly blue-gray, I don't want to take it. If it's an environment where the cube is slower, these kind of greedy gold decks with lots of splashes end up reigning supreme, I might be playing a 4-color deck that doesn't even have green in it, and Breeding Pool is still great because it turns all of my green fetches into a blue fetch and lets me kind of connect those dots in a way that makes sense.
Maybe we should even stop saying greedy decks, because I feel like you can have a well-balanced environment where like the 5-color Golos is a difficult deck to draft, but is viable.
Can it be viable and greedy?
Sure, okay.
How do you define greedy? Like, to me,
I think greedy is just maybe a little bit negative. It's saying like, okay, something's wrong with this environment that someone can just sort of ignore the rules and do this.
Maybe some people. I don't mean it that way when I say it. What I mean is like, I think about a deck that just says, I'm gonna take whatever cards I want. I'm greedy. I'm in the draft. I'm taking these cards. I'm gonna cast them. Like, I don't care. As opposed to somebody that's like allowing their draft to be dictated by the cards that are in the pack and say, well, that color's not open, or I didn't get into fixing. I just think of it as like trying as much as possible to assert dominance and just be greedy about the cards you want to cast. I really don't mean it negatively. Like, I want to support some degree of greedy decks in my environment. I want that to be possible. I don't want it to be every deck, but I want it to be possible. The same way I don't want every deck to be an aggro deck. It's just like a kind of deck I want to have some legs in my environment.
That's a lot of talk about lands.
Oh, it's so much talk about lands. And you recorded 2 podcasts today. You're a podcast all-star.
I don't think that makes me that.
Thank you, Lamem, for this question. I think it was a really great question. It's the kind of thing that I didn't even really think about talking about on the show until the question was asked, which is, of course, the perfect kind of question. If you have a question for the show, send it in an email at luckypaper.co. Hit us up on any of the various Discords of which we are subscribed, and or find us on Twitter. We'll take questions in all of those formats. All our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All of the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This has been Anthony and I coming at you live from Anthony's basement. Thanks for talking about Magic with me, Anthony.
Of course. I love talking about Magic. You know, I only played 2 lands in my Turbo Cube deck.
I did not know this.
That was exciting.
Did you really only play 2 lands? You had like 4 drops. You had 2 drops. You had 4 drops.
No, you're
in
right.
your deck.
I ended up siding in a mountain and cut one of my fetching things. Okay, 3 lands.
How did you do this?
So the way I did it was I had a ton of, land cycling cards and other cheap things that effectively got me lands.
Pause. You said you had a ton of land cycling cards?
Yes.
I think with 3 lands in your deck, you can't have a ton of land cycling cards. Otherwise, they're very quickly just dead cards that do nothing.
That did happen.
Okay, great.
But all my spells only cost 1 or 2 mana, so it was fine. But it was really interesting, actually. So I was playing kind of a wonky red-blue deck, which is mostly mono-red aggro, splashing Urza. So it was really critical that I got both the steam vents and the volcanic
You're
islands.
Undermining all of our credibility.
Without having both of the
sign-off.
duels, it just meant every single one of my lands was exactly a red-blue duel, and I could do whatever I wanted with them.
I did hear you say every single one of my lands is a red-blue duel. I just thought that was like 6, not 2. It was literally 2. So you only had cards that had mountain cycling or island cycling, because you can't do basic land cycling for the dual lands, obviously.
Correct. Yeah, I had to cut migratory routes. Very sad.
Yeah, rip. Well,
anyway, it was a good time.
You win the prize. I've never played a 2-land deck. You have definitely gone lower than me. Again, I thought 12 was pretty low in a traditional cube. I like to go like 5 to 7 in the turbo cube. 2 takes the cake.
Try 2.